The September 19th, 1991 episode of Later with Bob Costas featured broadcaster Charlayne Hunter-Gault, who was host at the time of the McNeil-Lehrer News Hour on PBS, their nightly broadcast of the news. And she had gone from, as Bob stated, being a news story to a newscaster. She was one of the students that crossed the racial segregation lines at the University of Georgia in 1961. Quite a fascinating and inspiring story that this lady has. Worth the watch, kids. It is 20 minutes long, so I mean, if you want to watch it in like 50, 20-second chunks for your attention span, go for it.
This was the University of Georgia in 1961. White students defiantly resisting the new order being forced on the South, integration. Backed by the federal courts, Charlayne Hunter and Hamilton Holmes walked past the gates of discrimination to become the first black students in the school's 175-year history. Their freshman orientation was a troubling one. Instead of barbecues and bonfires, they found smoking buildings and the South's ugliest symbol of hate, the burning cross. But intent on a career as a journalist, Charlayne carried on, even if it meant at times, in the classroom, she was an isolated figure. Acceptance came slowly and was never complete. But eventually, life got better for the 19-year-old Charlayne. She made friends and tried to lead as normal a college life as possible. The first difficult step in a career that would lead to major positions in both print and broadcast journalism for the young woman who became Charlayne Hunter-Gault. Thanks for staying up later. We're pleased to have Charlayne Hunter-Gault with us tonight. She's the New York-based national correspondent for the McNeil-Lehrer News Hour on PBS. But inevitably, as we go back over your life, we've got to start with the time when you were the story yourself rather than the person covering the story, and that's the integration of the University of Georgia in the early 1960s. Why did you want to do it? Knowing the hardship that was ahead, the indignities that were ahead, why as a young woman did you want to do it?
I'm not sure that I knew what was ahead when I decided to do it, that there would be hardship or indignities. I think that was part of what got both Hamilton Holmes, who was the other black student who went in with me, and I through. We just didn't anticipate the worst. We anticipated a normal thing. Now, that was, you know, a little silly perhaps in retrospect, but we were 19 years old and idealistic. And I really wanted to be a journalist. And the University of Georgia at that time was the only school in the state that had a school of journalism. So that my own ambitions, and I think Hamp's ambitions to be a doctor, coincided with the movement in the South, all over the South at the time, to begin to test the Brown decision or implement the Brown decision, which was the, you know, the landmark case that that ruled separate but unequal illegal.
You would have been about 11 or 12 when that decision was handed down.
12.
Okay.
Yeah, and I was living in Alaska.
In Alaska?
Yes, my father was stationed there, and my parents were living up there then, so it was kind of a remote place to be at that time, but that's where we were.
Obviously, you were a smart kid with an interest in current events. You wanted to be a journalist, from what I'm told, from the time that you were a small girl. Did you have any sense then, at age 12, when this decision came down, that it was important?
Not at all. I mean, I don't even remember too much actually about it, but like so many things in my life, there's a kind of pattern, and being from the South, this was, being in Alaska, this was the first actual experience I had had with integrated education. So while we were there only for a year, in a way, it was a preparation for me. Some years later, I guess I was in the 8th grade then, and that was 54, and it was 59 that we originally applied to the University of Georgia. So it's kind of an interesting little historical, there's circles and circles and circles, and this was one of those little circles where it began in 54. The groundwork was laid for my, I guess, appreciating an integrated setting. And, you know, because those can be a little bit intimidating if all you've ever known is one side or the other. So 54, I was on the on-base school where my father was stationed. I came back to Atlanta in '55 and started working on the school newspaper. And I would love to say that there were all these noble reasons, but I was really impressed by Brenda Starr. And I thought that that was just the neatest thing. I mean, I used to read the comic books, newspapers every day, turn straight to the comic pages. And there was my girl, Brenda, you know,
right.
having all these wonderful adventures with one-eyed mystery men and black orchids. And I thought, that's for me. And of course, it was a little ridiculous because in those days, they didn't have that many women, white or black. But I mean, I was into the fantasy.
Uh-huh.
And then I worked on the school newspaper throughout high school. I was very restless. I hated staying in class. And I could always get hall passes if I had some assignment I was working on. I mean, people respected then journalism. And so if I said to my English teacher, well, I've got an assignment I got to work on, she'd give me a hall pass.
Uh-huh.
And I guess I really didn't get totally serious about journalism and its potential impact on society until I actually became the center of the story. And we started a newspaper in Atlanta during that period because simultaneously while I was going into the University of Georgia, my peers were sitting in at the lunch counters and doing civil disobedience in Atlanta. So Julian Bond and a bunch of us started our own newspaper because the newspapers in town wouldn't cover what the students were doing. And that's when I began to realize the real potential and impact of journalism on society.
You applied in 1959. You didn't get in till 61, so there was some legal maneuvering in the interim, right?
That's right. We had to, as I think they used the legal term, we had to exhaust all of our administrative remedies before we finally went to court in December of 60. December of 60, there was a week-long trial. And then, you know, the Supreme Court decision of 54 had said that integration should proceed with all deliberate speed, but it hadn't. This was one instance in which the decision came down with lightning speed. We had the case argued in December of 60, and I had gone back to Detroit, Michigan, where I was in school at Wayne State University after the school Christmas holidays. January 61, just a few weeks after this case, the judge handed down the decision. I heard the news on the Friday in Detroit, and Monday I was walking onto the campus of the University of Georgia.
So at this point, is James Meredith even in at the University of Mississippi?
Well, I think
it's right about the same time,
right about the same time, a little bit later, because I remember being in my dormitory one night getting a call, and sometimes I got crank calls, and someone came to me and said, you have a call, and I said, oh, who is it? And they said, James Meredith, and I said, yeah, right. And they said, no, no. So I go to the phone, and I'm still not convinced it's Meredith. So I say, hello, and he says, hi, it's James Meredith. And I said, how do I know that? He said, hold on. And he held the phone out like this, and I could hear the protesting and rioting and gunshots, it sounded like, going on in the background. He came and he says, you convinced now? He was always a little strange. But I was convinced it was Meredith, yeah. So we were contemporaneous.
Now, how much of that did you face? Bricks through the window or
First
threats
night,
or whatever?
First night. I mean, the first day, the crowd was rambunctious, but not hostile. I mean, a little bit hostile, but not attacking us personally. Lots of catcalls and things like that. The second night, they gathered outside my dorm because in those days, girls had to live on the campus. Boys could live anywhere. So they knew where I was, and they gathered outside my dorm on Monday night.
They being students?
The students,
yeah.
And other provocateurs, I later learned. But Tuesday night, something happened. University of Georgia played its arch rival, Georgia Tech, in a basketball game, and there was a hotly disputed, I think it was the double overtime. And in the double overtime, there was still a disputed call, and Tech won. Simultaneously, I'm told, the lieutenant governor of the state was calling over to the campus, encouraging the law students not to take this lying down. This usurpation of states' rights was how the segregationists referred to it and looked on it. So the law students actually were the ones who were key in organizing this lawless demonstration outside my dorm, and that was the night that the brick came through my window, and that was the night of the full-blown riot. I think there were Klansmen, provocateurs, who knew who all was in that crowd outside. I certainly didn't think about it, but I think that the students, if they had been left to their own devices without encouragement from the highest levels of the government of the state, probably would have been boisterous and rambunctious for a couple of nights, and then it would have gone away. But they had a lot of encouragement. I delivered the graduation speech, the first black in all those years to deliver the graduation speech. I guess it was 25 years later. And in the wake of that, I got letters, as I have over the years, from people who have grown into their adulthood, and many of them have children now. And I guess in trying to teach their children to be citizens of society and the world, they have confronted some of the things that that they, I guess, the ways in which they were raised, and haven't wanted to do the same thing. And in confronting that, they have wanted to reach out to me, people I don't even remember. And they try to make me remember. And they said, well, you may not remember, but I just wanted you to know that I was sorry. Which is great, I think.
What did you say in that commencement speech 25 years later, after 200 years of the University of Georgia, first time a black had ever delivered the commencement speech? Of course, it was 175 years in existence before a black ever walked through as a student.
Right. I said, hello again. That was the first thing I said. And because I think that it's important, I mean, I have become such a student of history. I wasn't one when I was at the university, but I've become such a student of history because I think that to understand our history is so important as a way of helping us to understand where we're going. And so I thought that it was important to recount some of that experience for those students, many of whom were only vaguely aware, because our young people today are not that steeped in history. So I recounted some of it, and I recounted some of those letters that I've gotten from people over the years. But you used a word that I don't use, or if I do, it's a slip of the tongue. I do not use integration of the University of Georgia because I don't think that's happened yet. I don't think that integration in this country has happened. We're in a desegregation mode, but when integration is in your heart, you talked about in the heart. Desegregation is a legal thing. Integration is what happens when people truly begin to interact, and we haven't achieved that yet.
Who is this man, Clarence Thomas, the man President Bush wants on the U.S. Supreme Court? The answer to that question is our lead story tonight. The storyteller is Charlayne Hunter-Gault.
You're the national correspondent, as we said, for the McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour, and obviously that means you cover a wide spectrum of stories, and there's no particular emphasis in your case on issues that relate to black Americans. But I would guess that since there are relatively still few women and relatively still few blacks in positions of influence in network news, and I guess we can include your program as part of the network news
Thanks a lot.
spectrum. Do you feel some responsibility to help sensitize, to say, there's a story out here, or there's a perspective out here, and I don't even necessarily have to be the one to cover it, but you should be hip to this?
I think so. I think that all of my generation of minority and women journalists feel that way. And I've been fortunate to have been in circumstances all the time, and especially on this program, that is seen as a real positive. I mean, it speaks to the importance, I think, of diversity, particularly in news, because we all have different backgrounds and different experiences. And it's amazing to me when people find that a negative, because in my own experience with news, it's always been a positive. I mean, we do a lot of things on our program that come out of my head, and when we discuss them, obviously television, as you know, is a group process, but they come out of my own experience. They come out of conversations in my living room, and this is not an integrated society, as I said. I think there's very little social intercourse between blacks, whites, regardless of the socioeconomic level. I know in New York I see it all the time, or the lack of it. And so I bring my own experiences to bear on discussions in our deliberations, and they've always been very welcome.
Can you give me an example of a story that maybe your colleagues would have missed entirely, you brought to their attention, they were receptive to it, it got on the air?
Rap music, for example. Now, that may be a function of being black, but I think it's also a function of having teenagers in the house. I began to really pay attention to rap music, and I think 2 or 3 years ago we did a really interesting piece that everybody around is really laughing. Neil Lara is doing rap music.
I always thought Robert and Jim listened to Tone Loc myself.
They might. You'll have to ask them the next time they're on. But everybody was really receptive to it in terms of the way it was presented. And we did it the typical Neil Lara way, where we look at all sides, because, you know, there are those who think that there's something bad about it. And, you know, there are aspects of rap music that are not particularly good. But the way I approached it was I think, very interesting, although we did have to print the lyrics so that people could follow them. But as Ice-T told me, these lyrics weren't meant for adults. They're meant for young people. And as he pointed out, you know, all young people want to have their own little secrets from their parents, and that in part is what rap music is. What's that verse that goes, nightmare walking? What is it?
I'm a nightmare walking, psychopath talking, king of my jungle. I'm a gangster stalking.
I am a nightmare walking, psychopath talking, king of my jungle, just a gangster stalking, living life like a firecracker, quick as my fuse. The dead is the death, back the colors I choose. Red or blue, colors of blood, it just don't matter. Sucker dies for your life when my shotgun scatters. The gangs of LA will never die, just multiply color.
Most of the things that we do, I try to and we're doing it routinely as a matter of course now, include black people on the program who may have some expertise other than race, maybe the Soviet Union or Russian military or something, but because, you know, I try to get away from stereotypes. I'm doing the Clarence Thomas, I've worked on the Clarence Thomas profile. But that isn't because I'm black. I did Judge Souter and I did Judge Bork as well.
Some called him the stealth justice, unlike the highly prolific and controversial Robert Bork, whose nomination was defeated by his paper trail in 1987. With Souter, there seemed to be nothing to attack because the paper trail was simply not that visible.
The role Judge Bork played in the Saturday Night Massacre will no doubt be considered in the confirmation hearings. But senators, witnesses, and Bork himself are expected to concentrate on his record, speeches he's given, papers he's written, and opinions he's issued here at the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals.
Your personal objectives and your track record indicate that you have interests far beyond where people might want to pigeonhole you. But because you are something of a pioneer, you were in a position to influence, as we've just been talking about, influence the sensitivity level within the news organizations that you worked, including the New York Times. If I've got the story right, you had something to do with their making a policy change and stop referring to blacks as Negroes and start referring to them as blacks.
Right. It was, you know, it just seemed like the time was right for it. I mean, it was a different kind of thing than this whole discussion now about African American. It was a much more fundamental point of departure then, because it was political and it was just embraced by everybody. And it seemed to me ridiculous for the New York Times to continue to insist on calling people Negroes if generally the community, quote unquote, had decided they wanted to do something different. And I wrote an article in which I filed from Chicago, got on a plane, got to New York, and the paper was on the stands when I got there, and every other time I had referred to blacks, they had kind of changed it up and used Negroes sometime, used blacks sometime. And I was so incensed. I wrote a memo that turned out to be 13 pages long. It addressed an attitude on the part of the white media establishment that I wanted to speak to. And I wanted to say that you cannot sit back in your pristine ivory towers and make isolated judgments. Life is changing, things are changing, and you have to be aware of those changes. So it was more than just about changing Negro to black. It was about an attitude that white media had about, you know, because white media, and they still continue to do this, is anoint black leaders and say who's the leader and give them the credibility and give them the coverage, regardless of what's going on in the community. And I was saying that this is wrong and it's got to change. And they were very receptive to it.
Thanks to Charlayne Hunter-Gault, the national correspondent for the McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour on PBS. It was a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Time to clear out. See you later.